Hello guys and pals, as I said, we are gonna have a special review of modern horror games. Of course, before that, I saw it necessary that we have a brief history of horror games. And this is not gonna be so long brief history and not so short, just as it makes our way of feel our way brief. And before we go on, I need to tell you some things. There's some struggle among the horror horror fans of horror games. I mean, that they know some special game as a beginner of horror in horror games. And if you are familiar with horror games, one of them is Alone in the Dark 1, and another one is Resident Evil 1. And of course, anybody has their idea and it is respectful. But actually, in my idea, any game that comes has some experiences from before and some new ideas from itself, and it adds them to the game, and of course, distributes them. So maybe it's not so appropriate that if we tell some special game is a beginner of horror genre among the games. But of course, you want to say that these two games propound the horror genre among the games. That's true. But of course, you want to say that only these two games were the beginner of horror genre among the games. Of course, that is not true. Because if you investigate the older games than them, you can see that there were horror games at their times too, that they were good too. But these two games propound the horror genre seriously among the games. And there's something else that I need to tell you, and that is some of you may think that the father of horror genre, I don't mean Shinji Mikami, I mean the father game of horror genre is Resident Evil 4, and or some of you may think that it is Amnesia, and I want to explain about them. And this is a very important tip that I need to explain about it, and so be cautious about this. I'm gonna tell you the services and the tips these two games made for horror genre among the games, and so I'm gonna explain them for you. And when we arrive to the differences between Resident Evil 4 and Amnesia Dark Descent, I'm gonna explain it for you. So be really cautious about these tips. This is really important, and if you make enough cautious about it, you are gonna be so knowledgeable among the horror games. About the horror games. Another tip. I brought the games, I explained about the games that were really important and impressive about among the horror games, about the horror genre, the games. So maybe some of you don't see some other games, some good horror games, for example, like Visage. And of course, look, we are not gonna explain like that. For example, if you are familiar with Steam software, and if you go in Steam environment, you can see a lot of horror games that are being produced every day that you may not have seen only for once their picture or their logo. And we're not gonna explain like that. We are just gonna explain about the very important games and have a specialized review on them. The first game we're gonna explain about is Alone in the Dark 1, that you know it if you are a fan of horror games. This game is produced by Infogrames Studio in 1992 and tried to propound the horror genre among the video games seriously. And of course, there was another feature that made it very successful, and that's it. For the first time, there was a 3D environment playable in this game. And before that, there were 2D games, really more than 3D games. But as I said, there was a 3D playable environment in this game for the first time. Another feature is that there was a female character for the first time in the horror games in this game. And this made it special too for this game, for the first time. The next numbers were made too, but they weren't as much successful as the first number. Alright guys, this was the explanation about the Alone in the Dark one. I hope you enjoyed it. But the next game that we are gonna explain is Resident Evil 1. If you get exact on this game, you can understand that this game and Alone in the Dark 1 are really similar to each other, especially in objectives and environment, and even about the story, that both of them are started about a mansion, and they get into mansion and confront different monsters, and even some doors and closets in these two games are like each other too. But of course, from different aspects, the Resident Evil 1 was more successful than Alone in the Dark 1. And this work of Shinji Mikami made the horror game genre very more seriously. Because of the success of number 1, the number 2 was distributed in January 1992. Resident Evil 2 had a better performance, and this made it more successful than number 1, and was pronounced as another successful works of Capcom Company. And about the important tips that should be mentioned is that the story was really better than number 1. It wasn't so unrealistic like number 1. And another tip is that the gameplay of the gameplay was really better than number 1. It wasn't so hard to kill zombies like number 1. And graphic of the game was really better than number 1, and especially the colors of the game. And this made the Resident Evil 2 very successful. And another important tip that I should mention is that there were more different monsters than number 1, and it had the very good focus on physical horror of the game too. And of course, there was a systematic case, a strategy case that you could carry your items in it, and it made the game very more attractive than number 1. This case could get bigger and larger in the game by the items you found. And there were appropriate guns to confront the monsters too. Then we reached to Resident Evil 3 that was released in 1999. This game was successful too, and plus that it had new systematic strategies for fighting against the enemies. So this tip made this game more successful than number 2, and one of these systems was the strategic fighting of Jill Valentine against the enemies, and that was dodging. Another tip is that the existence of Nemesis in the game made the game more exciting than the previous number. Although this made the game more action, but it made some horror moments for you when you were confronting with Nemesis. Of course, this game was more action than the previous number, but it was successful and a very good horror game among the horror games. So I really suggest you to have an experience of this game, and it does worth to have it. Of course, it's old, but it does worth. In that year, the Silent Hill 1 was released. That is another stars of the horror games. One of the reasons that Konami made this game was competing with Resident Evil. But there's an important tip, and is that this game has focused on psychology more than action. But of course, it's still one of the best horror games that you should experience, and when it was released, it had a lot of positive criticizes and points. So these reasons made this game so successful too. After all, in 2001, we reach another most important horror game, and it is Silent Hill 2. But from which aspect this is one of the most important horror games? Look, for the first time Silent Hill 2 showed that even the games can have deep and beautiful and perfect stories. The story of Silent Hill 2 is one of the best stories among the games, and for not spoiling that story, I don't tell you anything anymore, but can just tell you that it is one of the best stories, especially among the horror games. And another tip that was really more in this game is it is different ends that makes the players to do the game for several times. Especially the dog ending. In the year 2002, the Resident Evil 0 was released. That was about the happenings of before Resident Evil 1. This game was successful too and was trying to show the old environments like Resident Evil 1, especially Spencer Mansion in Resident Evil 1. This game hadn't anything new, but it was good as a horror game. So I advise you to experience it too. Then we reached to Silent Hill 3 in 2003. This game is one of the most important horror games too. But you may not have seen it from this aspect. I'll tell you about the tips of it later, but now in general I can say that for the first time this game made the elements of an environment of a horror game very well. Silent Hill 4 was released in 2004. The story of it wasn't as good as Silent Hill 2, and the gameplay wasn't as good as Silent Hill 3, and it was something between these two games. And it made this worthable to play it at least for once. So it made Konami to make the next number of it, I mean Silent Hill 5 or Homecoming. Then we reached to one of the best important horror games in 2005 that you may have heard its name even if you are not a fan of horror games. This work of Mr. Shinji Mikami and his team was the father of the standards of the modern horror games. And of course, this was just one of them, and another one is Amnesia Dark Descent. One of the most familiar standards in Resident Evil 4 that you all know is the camera of the Resident Evil 4 game that we use in third person nowadays games. Of course, even nowadays we see some games use the fixed camera too, but we don't see them a lot. Most of them use the camera on shoulder. And as the first game, we are gonna have a special review of this game. So I'll tell you the details of this game in there. Because of the success of Silent Hill series, Konami released Silent Hill 5 or Homecoming in 2008. There were some troubles in making Silent Hill Homecoming, like closing the Japanese studio of Silent Hill Homecoming and leave it to a Western company. Collective and Helix Games made a middle game that wasn't bad, but it wasn't so good that players expected. As good as players expected. And this caused negative points for this game. In some fields like story and music, this game was good. But the gameplay wasn't so good. In that year we reached to another one of the most important games, Dead Space 1. And briefly we can say it is the father of science fiction horror modern games. Although it has still some negative tips, but it's still one of the best horror games that hasn't anything like it yet. There's no game like it. And of course, if it was necessary, I will record some videos separately for Dead Space, and I'll explain you the tips of the game. So you wanted to go on science fiction games, I'll explain it. In 2009, the Resident Evil 5 was released. And although it had good story and gameplay, but there wasn't any horror elements in it anymore. So this made Capcom somehow hateful among the gamers and like a company that is just looking for money, not the quality of games. Cause in Resident Evil 5 you don't see a lot of horror elements. Of course there are some of them, but they are not a lot or satisfying. While the fans of Resident Evil expected Resident Evil 5 even better than Resident Evil 4 in horror genre. For example, it's not cloudy and it's always sunny or light in all the times of the game. So this game was successful but wasn't very good in horror genre. Exactly opposite to Resident Evil 4 that was really great among the horror games. But you should experience it at least for once. Then we reached to one of the most and best important horror games in 2010, Amnesia Dark Descent. This game made special standards and services for horror games, and I'll tell you later. But for now, in general, I can tell you that it made special horror genre and standard that the games like Outlast 1 and 2 are in the continues of this game, and that makes it very special. So I advise you to have an experience from it and at least play it for once. In 2011 we reached to another most horrible games in the history, and that is Dead Space 2. Somehow it didn't have anything new than number 1, but it was really better than number 1 because of the improvement of gameplay, speed, movements, and some cinematic scenes. And especially by the horrible necromorphs that was confronting the character of the game, Isaac Clarke. It got one of the best horror games throughout the history of video games. So try to experience it at least for once.